Welcome to Greener Pastures Ranching, our pasture walk for 2020. Now, we decided not to have an actual pasture walk this year because of COVID-19, and we're going to do a virtual pasture walk. So I guess that means I don't need this stupid thing. We are going to do a little bit of a different pasture walk this year because it's a virtual one. We're going to go to some remote places that we normally can't get to with the truck and trailer. So you're going to see some different stuff this year, so it'll be kind of unique. We got some pretty hard terrain to get to some of these places, and that's why I've got the Sidekick, because it can get just about anywhere. It's my little ATV. So we're also going to take a journey up to the Gateway Research Organization heifer pasture. They help me co-host this pasture walk every year, and we get to go up and see some of their water systems and some of their grazing techniques as well. So that's kind of a unique part to this pasture walk this year. So it's going to be just a private tour, just you and me. We're going to get maybe a little bit intimate, but not too intimate because my wife's the camera lady. So, but it'll be very personal, one-on-one, and you can enjoy the ride. Let's jump in the Sidekick and go for a tour. So what is regenerative grazing? Well, basically, I've got 5 grazing principles that we need to look at. It's the basics of regenerative agriculture, and it's how we manage our ranch here at Greener Pastures Ranching. So number 1 is water cycle. We've been damaging the water cycle for many, many, many years. Thousands of years, agriculture's been causing a reverse water cycle. We need to correct that and fix that and build the water cycle and repair it. It would be incredible the amount of climate change that we could mitigate just by managing the water cycle on a global scale. So how do we do that? We have to leave residue. We have to build what's called a soil armor. It's the residue left on top after we finish grazing, and that goes to cover the ground. The importance of that is we need to reduce the amount of runoff that occurs. So runoff happens when that first raindrop comes down. Let's look at that at a microscopic level. That first raindrop comes down, it's like a tiny explosion when it hits the soil. Okay, the raindrop comes down, explodes, and breaks the soil particles, the aggregates, back into particles. Remember we talked about the exudation that glues particles together? Well, now that raindrop is breaking them apart. So the first raindrop causes the damage, the second raindrop comes down, and it hits this smooth surface. We've all seen a capped soil. Most of us have seen it after it's dried up. So it's a smooth surface with cracks through it. Well, before it dries up, it's this smooth surface that second raindrop can't penetrate through because it's sealed off, all those fine particles. So the raindrop has to run off. So all those other raindrops run off, and the more slope you have, the worse the runoff is. So how do we prevent runoff? We have to cover the soil. We call it the soil armor because it's stronger than the raindrops. So the raindrop's stronger than the soil, but the plants are stronger than the raindrops. So this time, if we've got a live or dead plant material covering the soil, the raindrop comes down, hits the plant material, and now the raindrop bursts into tiny little particles. And then it soaks through and into the soil without doing any damage. Okay, so we need to stop that runoff. We need to leave soil armor. The other part to the water cycle is evaporation. Right? We have an enormous amount of water lost due to evaporation. And same thing, we need to prevent that by leaving more residue on the soil surface. So how evaporation works in the soil, if you've got bare exposed soil and the wind's blowing across it, drying it out, the sun's beating down on it, warming it up, then the top layer evaporates, just like any water would. Now, the difference is the soil moisture now doesn't work by gravity, it works by diffusion. And diffusion is a movement from an area of greater concentration to lesser concentration. So in this case, wet to dry. So the top layer dries out and evaporates, then the moisture from down below moves up in the soil profile. Now it'll evaporate, and then more will move up and it'll evaporate. So we've got this water coming up through the soil profile instead of properly going down. So we have to protect the soil by leaving this soil armor. The third way is to slow down infiltration. Okay, so we need to have that water infiltrate down into the soil profile, but do it slowly. We don't want to have it go really quickly. If you have a really sandy soil, it could rain and then, a day later it's dry again. So depending on your soil type, but we want to build as much organic matter in the soil as well to hold on to that water. So basically what we just described was a healthy water cycle. So in a healthy water cycle, the moisture evaporates from our lakes and our streams and our ponds, forms clouds, precipitates down, soaks into the soil and down and infiltrates through and fills our water bodies from below ground. Okay, so that's a healthy water cycle. Now, an unhealthy water cycle, which most of agriculture has today, the moisture evaporates out of the soil, okay, forms clouds, rains down, and hits that capped soil, causes capped soil, and then runs off, and it fills our water bodies from soil runoff or top runoff. And with that, it's also washing away with erosion and taking our good organic matter with it. Okay, so that unhealthy water cycle we need to change, and that's one of the principles in regenerative grazing. Okay, the second principle in regenerative grazing is harvesting the sun. Okay, we have a energy flow that comes from the sun through the plants and to the animals. We need to harvest more sun. Okay, we need to harvest as much as we possibly can. So all these blades of grass out here to me are little solar panels, and I want to get as much of that as I possibly can. So how do I maximize that? We have a very short growing season here by Busby. We only have about 4.5 months of growing season, so we got to optimize the amount of sunlight we can capture. One, I want all of the soil covered, okay, with live growing plant material. You can see the ground here, very, very solid, lots of green matter to collect sunlight. If that sun comes down and hits bare soil, it's just hitting the dirt, it's going to reflect, and we're not going to capture that sun. We need a vegetative growing active plant to capture that sun. In doing so, that through photosynthesis, we're going to get glucose translocated to the roots, and then we're going to be pushing that exudate out through the root system and growing the soil as well. So we want to get as much of that growing season as possible. Early in the growing season, definitely want to have my plants very, ready to grow, actively growing as soon as possible in the spring. So I want to have the moisture there, I want to have the nutrients available, I want to have my plant roots very strong so that they can jump out of the ground. Okay, so we want to get as much late season growth as well. I want to have good vegetative growth late into the season so that we're still collecting sunlight. In most situations, continuous grazing, by the end of the season, we've got a bunch of stage 3 grasses and plants that have gone to seed and are mature, not collecting very much sunlight. And we've got a bunch of stage 1 grasses that have been chewed off all summer that have basically gone dormant. So I want to, right up until that killing frost, for me in probably about mid-September, I want to have active growing stage 2 vegetative plants. Okay, so that's harvesting as much sunlight as we possibly can. The other principle in regenerative grazing is recycling nutrients. Okay, that's an important part of my operation. I'm trying not to export nutrients. If I was in the business of grain crops, I'm exporting 90% of the nutrients out of my land every crop, right? It's leaving my land. If I was in the hay business, okay, I would be making bales or making silage, and I'd be exporting that off my land. Okay, with a regenerative grazing operation as a custom grazer, the advantage is the livestock. They're 80% inefficient. It's a great opportunity for us because only 20% gets exported away from our land. The other nutrients goes back into our soil through the manure and the urine, which, by the way, the manure is the best compost you'll ever have to add to your land, and the urine is the best biological tea you could ever possibly add to your land. So we're getting a great deal with recycling the nutrients here. On top of that, another one of the grazing principles is building biology. Okay, and that goes along with the animals. They like to, they're very good at adding biology to our land through the manure and the urine. But we're trying to build biology in the whole system. That's soil biology and biology above ground as well. So when we're talking about soil biology, there's a lot of different critters out there that we're trying to manage. I look at them as my employees. They work for me for room and board. All I have to do is give them food, water, and shelter, and they work tirelessly for me. So one of the examples of that is the Mycorrhizae Fungi. It's a network of fungus that lives in the soil. Up until probably, 10 or 15 years ago, we didn't really know very much about Mycorrhizae fungi, mostly because they don't live in our soils anymore, right? We've managed to kill them all off in agriculture. So they knew about them in the jungles and under forests because they're naturally interwoven with the trees, But we're supposed to have it on our agricultural land too, but most of it does not have it anymore. So we need to take care of that fungus. The reason it's so important is it is a network of moving nutrients around in the soil. Okay, so it's really good at collecting nutrients for the plants. The fungus basically has arbuscules which attach to the plant roots and interconnect the plants, and they have hyphae that reach out, and you can think of them as root hairs. If this fungus is attached to the plant roots, and now the hyphae of the plant or of the fungus can reach out and get nutrients for the plant, it can reach up about 1,000 times more distance than just the roots alone. So that's a huge benefit to the plants. This is a symbiotic relationship that we really need to encourage in our soils. So this fungus can actually also bring water to the plants. In a time of a drought, can you imagine if your roots can reach that much further, how much better your plants will do? So Mycorrhizae fungi is a very important part of my operation. The bacteria in the soil, right? There's all sorts of symbiotic relationships between plants and bacteria. One of the most common ones we know of is the nitrogen fixation. The legumes and the bacteria work together. So everybody knows that legumes produce nitrogen for your plants, right? Or for your crop. But it's actually the bacteria that produces the nitrogen, not the plant. The plant produces the sugar, right, through photosynthesis, and then exchanges a molecule of sugar with the bacteria for a molecule of nitrogen, right? Fair trade all around. So we need to take care of the biology to get the free fertility. This patch of vetch here I'm standing in, a great example of that. The bacteria that are associated with this are the ones that get the credit for bringing in the nitrogen, not necessarily the plant. So soil biology is a very important principle that I work on. The last principle is the idea of a polyculture. Okay? Agriculture has been stuck on a monoculture for far too long. I've said it a lot of times before, a monoculture is ugly. Okay? It's a polyculture that is beautiful. We need to get a polyculture of root systems in the soil, and that they produce different types of sugars which feed a different type of bacteria. Okay, so the more diversity you have in plants, the more diversity you have in root systems, the more diversity you'll have in soil organisms. Okay, the bacteria and the fungus and the nematodes and the yeast and the fungi, we need all those things in our soil, and that polyculture is what's going to do that. So again, just to recap quickly, the 5 principles that we're looking at in regenerative agriculture, we need to fix the water cycle. Okay, we definitely need to work on that, fixing the water cycle. We have to harvest as much sunlight as we possibly can, number 2. Collect it for as long as we can in the season, and try not to miss any, right, by having an active living plant there all year long. We need to recycle nutrients. We need to stop exporting it. Okay? We need to build biology. Okay? There's no need to add fertility when we can build biology, and then we get all the fertility that we want. And the 5th one is polyculture, getting that diversity in your pastures and in your land, and that adds to the whole the biodiversity within our whole system. So those are the grazing principles. Okay, we talked about the grazing principles. That is what we're trying to accomplish out of this whole regenerative grazing. Now we need to know how we do it. So let's talk about the grazing concepts. There's 5 grazing concepts: graze period, rest period, stock density, animal impact, and soil armor. So let's talk about graze period and rest period together. They're 2 of the concepts that work very, very closely together, and what we're trying to do there is prevent overgrazing. Okay, so graze period is the amount of time that the animals are on a paddock. So picture the paddock that I'm standing in and the paddock behind us where the cattle are. It's the amount of time that they're on that particular paddock. They might be on that one for two days, maybe 3 days, and then they're going to move on to this paddock. So the amount of time that they're on that specific paddock. Now the rest period is the time in between grazing. So it's the amount of rest and recovery time that the plants have before the animals are allowed back on that land again. So what we're trying to do with graze period and rest period is to avoid overgrazing. Overgrazing by definition is just a measurement of time, nothing else. It doesn't matter how many animals, it doesn't matter how many acres each paddock is, it's a timing on the grazing. By definition, we need to prevent the second bite. Okay, so if the animals are turned out into this pasture, they graze it all down, but they're out here for too long a time period, and the plants are able to start to regrow. Okay, it puts up a new leaf. That new leaf is what, if the animals are still out there and they're allowed to come graze that new leaf, that's what we call the second bite. We want to avoid that. So we have to have the animals onto a paddock and then off of it before the plants start to regrow. Okay, so we got to have a graze period short enough to prevent that second bite. Okay. The opposite side of that is the rest period, so the time in between grazings. So we have to get the animals off and then allow enough recovery time so that those plants can get into a later stage 2, because what happens is we use up the energy reserves regrowing. We've got to give it enough time so that the plant can recover, not only to grow but also to replenish those energy stores in the plant, okay, in that perennial plant. So the rest period has to be long enough to have full recovery of those plants. So if the rest period is too short, the plants get to regrow and just get started. You might have some green matter up there, but we haven't replenished those energy reserves yet. So really it's still taking a second bite. It's the timing of grazing the plant before the energy reserves have replenished. So graze period and rest period have to work together. The next grazing concept is animal impact. Animal impact is the physical stimulation on the soil by the animal's hooves. Okay? That hoof action can cause seed to soil contact, it can break up a capped soil, it can push plant matter down and get it to recycle. So it's really important, that animal impact on the soil. Now, there's more to it than just the physical impact on the soil. One of the parts of this concept that I missed for many, many years was actually the biological component to this as well. The fact that the animals are out there bring biology into our system as well. So we've got biology in the manure, we've got biology in the urine, there's biology in the saliva as they're grazing, even that gooby gobby ball of snot that drips off their nose that makes you go, is it just me? Maybe. Even that has biology in it, or it's food for biology. There's even biology that falls off their hair coat onto the land. So there's a symbiotic relationships between the biology in the herbivore and the biology in the soil. So we've got two parts to that animal impact, is the physical stimulation and the biological stimulation. Both very important in our system of regenerative grazing. Okay. Stock density is the fourth grazing concept, very important in our system as well. Now a little definition here before we get going. Stock density is the number of animals on a piece of land at a given point of time. Okay. Stocking rate, don't get confused with stocking rate, that's the number of animals on a pasture for the whole season. So let's say I had 500 head on this pasture for the season, that's stocking rate. But if I have 500 head on 20 acres for a day, now that's my stock density. So basically it's how grouped up are they? Obviously these girls in behind us are quite grouped up right now, so it's got a very high stock density right now. So there's two benefits to high stock density. The higher the stock density, the better. The two benefits are even plant utilization and better manure distribution. Okay, so plant utilization. Picture a haybine going across your field and mowing it all down. Okay, every plant gets cut, so no plant has the advantage. So with a continuous grazing situation, what happens is the cattle get to go out and pick and choose which plants they eat. So the undesirable ones actually have the benefit, right? They get to mature and reproduce and be prolific, whereas the most desirable plants get chewed off over and over and over, and they have a hard time. So with a high stock density, our plant utilization is even because they graze everything down at the same rate. Everything gets knocked down. Even the undesirables, they might get stepped to the ground. Okay, so what we're trying to do is create an even playing field for all the plants when they regrow. So the higher the stock density, the better the plant utilization. The other benefit is manure distribution. Okay, so the higher the stock density, the better the manure and the urine gets spread around the land. So if the animals are let to graze continuously, so they spread out all over, your manure and urine end up by the trees or by the watering area or wherever they lounge. They get up and they poop and pee in one spot usually. So we're having a nutrient transfer to different places in the land that we don't really want. Ideally, we want the nutrients to come out and go back right where they came from. So with a high stock density, that's what happens. They're all over the place, and if we're mob grazing, is one of the terms we use, is very high stock densities. It's really hard to walk around out there without getting some manure on your boots. The stock density is that high that it's spread very, very well. So stock density has the two benefits: plant utilization and manure distribution. And the fifth grazing concept is building soil armor. Leaving residue on the land is so important. It's part of the concepts that I kind of overlooked for many, many years. We need to put more residue down to help build that water cycle. And we already talked about the water cycle earlier, so we'll leave it at that. But yeah, that fifth concept is so important of building that soil armor to protect everything. So the 5 grazing concepts, we've got graze period and rest period, work together, very important. We've got animal impact, we've got stock density, and we have soil armor. We need to have all 5 of those concepts. And if you need to remember them, there was an 8-year-old in one of my classes one year that said, that's really easy to remember, you just have to look at the first letters. G, R, A, S, and S. So it spells grass. So that's an easy way to remember the 5 grazing concepts. Well, that was a longer drive than most. We normally don't take our pasture walk all the way up here, but we are at the Gateway Research Organization Heifer Pasture. We're just north of Westlock, but we've set up kind of an interesting study here at the Grow Heifer Pasture. We are doing multiple different styles of grazing all on the same piece of land. So we've designed the cell, or taken the cell design into 4 different types of cell design. We've got a pipeline system, a alleyway system, single alley system, and a 2 alley system, so it's actually done twice, and we've got a cell center system design. So we've got different types of cell design here, and we also have 3 different types of grazing. We've got a continuous grazing setup, that's where I'm standing right now, and we've got a regular rotational grazing or regenerative grazing, and on the back side of the fence behind me is actually what we call mob grazing, so very high stock density grazing. So we're trying to see 3 different styles of grazing all in the same piece to show the contrast between them. So we just started this last year, so it's just kind of rolling, getting into progress here. Hopefully we'll really show some good contrast in the next few years over here. So where I'm standing is the continuous graze. As I said, we've got 5 animals out here on 10 acres, and they're out here for the entire season. So they definitely, pick and choose what they want. There's no rest, graze period is constant, very low stock density, not very good animal impact. Okay, so on the other side of the fence, this is our mob grazing. You can see the girls in the back there. In this paddock, it's the same size, 10 acres, but we have 80 heifers there. We're strip grazing down this paddock. So they're still out there for the same amount of time as the other paddocks, about 3 days right now. But during those 3 days, we used a strip fence and we strip grazed down it. So that kept our graze period and rest period the same as the regenerative grazed the rest of the pasture. What it did was increase the stock density and the animal impact on that little spot when we're strip grazing. So we're on day 3. You can see the difference in residue left behind. Definitely there's a lot more on the mob grazed piece. So over the next couple of years, we're going to see a big contrast on this fence line once we get this going. So now the before picture, obviously we've got lots of grass out here. Now it's already been grazed once this year on the mob grazing side, and of course on the continuous grazing they've been out here the whole time. So after we graze it the second time, we're still going to leave a lot of residue out on the mob grazing paddock. That's part of the idea of the mob grazing, is actually to step a bunch of the forage down to the ground. That helps with leaving residue, building your soil armor, which helps with the water holding capacity and builds this, recycles the nutrients and builds this system of nutrients recycling, so that in the future we're going to have a lot more growth on this side. Now, like I said, you can see we've left a lot more residue. These girls have actually already grazed this piece and they're on the next one. Yeah, we're going to see a stark difference here in the next few years. So this is the watering site that we set up last year at the Gateway Research Organization Heifer Pasture. We've set it up as a gas-powered pump with a tank that gravity feeds to 2 troughs. So basically we can just pump this old tank right full, and then it'll gravity flow out. And we can go a long ways with gravity flow as long as you've got the height difference. The one trough over this way, it's about 500 feet away that we're gravity flowing to, and then the one off behind us here, it's about 1,000 feet away. And we have no trouble keeping up to this herd at all. It actually flows really quickly because we've got the elevation here with this tank up on the hill. So what I normally do is I fill the tank with a guesstimated amount of fuel. You know, in my language, it's 6 or 7 blurbs of fuel, and that will probably fill this tank right up. And then when the pump runs out of fuel, it just shuts off. So you can actually, you know, put a little bit of fuel in this gas-powered pump and just walk away from it. As long as it's running, you can walk away from it and this thing will fill up. If it does overflow, if you put a little bit too much fuel in the pump, not a big deal. It's designed that this tank will overflow back down into the dugout, and it won't overflow at either troughs because both troughs have a float valve on at the trough. So the water doesn't drain out of the tank because the gas-powered pump actually has a check valve inside it. So once it shuts off, then it'll hold the water from going back into the dugout. And yeah, that would be a gas-powered pump system with a gravity flow. Hey, so I hope that ride wasn't too bumpy for you. It's hard to get out here. This is a fairly remote watering site, and years ago we drug this rock picker out here. We have a fleet of solar-powered rock pickers here at Greener Pastures Ranching. All 3 of these that I have been imported from Saskatchewan, actually. That's where my family farm originally from. So what we do is we take these old rock pickers that have basically about 150 to 200 gallon trough, and I mount a toolbox to it. And that's where the battery and the sun saver and everything goes. Somehow we'll tip up the forks and mount a solar panel. They're all a little bit different, but we've got solar panels mounted on them. And it works great as a trough. We're very portable. We can move it around if we need to. This one's been sitting here in the same spot for a while. We just moved the pump between a couple of sites because we've got quite a few troughs in this pasture. So it is set up in a watering area. We've protected our riparian area behind us. Again, we've talked about dragonflies and spiders and duck nesting and all that type of things. Technically, we've got 8 paddocks that are watering out of this rock picker. Now, it was really easy to set up. Basically, it has a solar panel that charges a battery, that being the toolbox. The float switch, you can see the yellow thing in the water. When they drink it down, that float switch drops. It's a reverse action float switch, which I just buy at Princess Auto or any home hardware store. And when the water drops down, it turns the pump on. And when it fills back up, it'll turn the pump off. So this just always remains full. So works really well. And we leave the hose and the trough at each site and just move the pump around. The pump is the expensive part, so works pretty well. So if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next site. So this is another site that you won't see on our regular pasture walk. It's quite remote. It's a long trip to get in here. Quite a few years ago, we dragged this old hay feeder in here as a water trough, and I don't ever want to drag it out. It wasn't that easy. So basically, we've got a homemade solar system here. We've got a bilge pump out in the water with a float, and a solar panel charging a battery. There's not very much lift here, so it doesn't take very much to make this solar system work. We've got actually 673 head on this water system right now with tiny little solar panels, so the lift is quite shallow. So the battery is actually charging both the water system and the fencer. Charges the battery and runs both of them. So basically, when they drink it down, there's a float switch in the trough that turns on the pump. Pump fills it up, and then it shuts it off when it's full. So pretty simple system. The fencer, that's one of my favorite fencers right here. It's a Speedrite 3000. That's a 3-joule fencer. Very similar, or same exact fencer would be a Stay-Fix ×3. Same fencer, just a different color. And that's what's powering the fence here. Now we've got probably 8 kilovolts in the fence, but we're only running maybe a half mile of polywire. The perimeter's all barbed wire. We've got a couple of offsets, but we're not running very much fence here. So we've also fenced off the entire dugout here. There's an electric wire that goes around it so that they don't have access. That's protecting our riparian area so that we have nice clean water for the animals, but also clean water for the insects and biodiversity in our system. We want to get some predator insects out here, dragonflies, spiders, things like that, to help deal with pests if they become a problem. So we do definitely want to protect our water systems here. So 12 years ago we built this riparian area, but we also fenced around it. So we put a one-wire electric all the way around this riparian area, and it's actually expanded past my fence in a couple spots this year because it's so wet. But we've protected this and kept it natural. Great for springtime nesting for the birds, waterfowl. Good for insect reproduction. Spiders, they need the long, tall grass to hang their egg sacs from. So we need to protect that to keep that tall grass. The dragonflies need the tall grass to sit on to rebreed. So we need to keep this area from the cattle and keep it protected. So we do put electric fencing around and keep the cattle out of this riparian area. As you can see in the background, that the water is actually covered in a green substance. It's actually duckweed. It's not not covered in algae by any means. It's a duckweed. Now, duckweed is a small plant. It's like a tiny little lily pad with a long root system. And what it does is actually cleans the water for us. So it's taking out nitrates and phosphates out of the water. So in the background there, that duckweed, that's a good thing. We want that in our riparian areas. All right, here we are at another piece of property. We're actually standing in the ditch. We got a road between two fields here. We're going to have a little bit of a talk about weed management. I personally think there's no such thing as a weed. They are pioneer species that come in to heal the land when the conditions are harsh, right? They have a job to do. That's their purpose. They heal the soil and make it easier for the next generation to take over. Now, what could make conditions harsh for plants would be dry conditions, overgrazing, lack of nutrients, soil conditions, pH, saline, whatever. So that could make the conditions favorable for that type of plant. Now, I constantly get the argument thrown at me about, well, the weed came in from my neighbor's land, or the weed came in from the ditch, or the oil field company brought the weed in. Bale grazing, a lot of people say, well, the bale grazing brought the weeds in. Now we've got weeds all over the place. It's not where the seeds came from that's the problem. Okay, the issue is with the management. We need to favor the conditions for the desirable species to take over from the weeds. The weeds are there to heal the ground. If you let them heal the ground, then they disappear. Okay, they're just a symptom telling you that the system is out of balance. So we have to address the problem of overgrazing. So it doesn't matter what weed it is. Everybody's got different weeds, different issues coming in. This happens to be buttercup. There's a lot of buttercup in our part of the world here in Alberta. It's taken over large areas of land. You can see in the background here, we've got quite a bit of buttercup in this field. It's continuously grazed. Okay. Now, what we should do with a piece of land like this is regeneratively graze it, break it up into smaller pieces, and have a good graze period, a good rest period, a good animal impact and good stock density, and leave some soil armor. Okay, those are the 5 grazing concepts that we need to work with to make sure that our pastures are healthy, and basically that will take the symptom away, right? If we can address the problem of overgrazing, then the symptom goes away. So that's what we're trying to do. So buttercup is one that, it's a good example because a lot of people talk about getting your animals to eat the weeds. Okay, well, they're not going to eat buttercup. It actually stings their mouth. They don't want to eat it. So we need to outcompete it, is my goal definitely with buttercup. So right across the road here is one of my pastures that we've been grazing for probably, I think, 14 years. And we don't have a buttercup issue over there. We don't have the symptom of buttercup, and it's right across the road. You can't tell me that, we get more rainfall than this piece. You can't tell me that it's different soil type, because it's right across the road from each other. So what we need to do is manage it so that we outcompete it. And I'm gonna walk across here right now, and we'll show you the difference between the two fields right across the road. All right, here we are across the road. This is our pasture. It was grazed about 2 weeks ago, so it's not super tall by any means, but it's coming back. We're gonna have about 3 to 4 weeks left of growth here before we actually graze it again. So it'll look really good. But this is right across the road. Okay, we've got alfalfa, we've got clover, we got red clover, white clover, there's some sweet clover over there, dandelion, there's creeping grasses, there's bunch grasses. We've got all sorts of different plants out here. We've got a polyculture of plants. We don't need to have any amendments because we're just building up the soil, and the regenerative grazing is causing this, right? It's causing a polyculture of plants. Now, I don't mind if there's the odd weed out here. Okay, because I actually did notice this. There's one buttercup I just picked. It's the only one I can see around. So you can't tell me the seeds aren't here. I don't mind having this here. It's not taking over. It's not getting out of hand like across the road. But when we're done grazing, this is still here for the pollinators. Right? Everything else might be knocked down and flattened, and this buttercup might still be here so the pollinators have something to eat. So I don't mind having this at all. Dandelions out here, I don't mind them. They're not a weed. They're actually a very healthy part of the animal's diet. They're loaded with antioxidants. So it's more like a probiotic for my animals. I don't mind dandelion at all. Ask any honey producer if dandelion's a weed. Those flowers come nice and early for the bees, so we want dandelions out here. So basically, I guess my argument when people come to me and always complain that the weeds came in from the neighbors or it came in from somewhere, okay, it's not your neighbor's management that creates your land or your pasture, okay, it's your management. Doesn't matter where the weeds came from. Every square foot of soil has 4,000 to 5,000 seeds in it already. Okay? We need to suppress those weed seeds from germinating because they'll get stimulated by a drought or poor management or poor growing conditions, and that's when these pioneer species kick into gear. So if we have good growing conditions and a good pasture management, then there's no need for these to germinate. They'll stay dormant in the soil for a long time. We're just suppressing them. After a drought, I might have some more of these pop up. Maybe we'll hit one spot a little harder. We'll be out here during a rainstorm and we'll hammer at one spot. Well, the next year, yeah, I'll get some pioneer species come up in that spot. But with good grazing management, we can knock them out in a year or two. It's not a big deal. It's part of the polyculture. We just don't want them to take over the field. So that's our weed talk for today. Let's move on to the next site. Well, this is my absolute favorite stop on the pasture rock every year. So this is our Pasture Piggies. They come in the spring. We buy them as weaner pigs, and we fatten them up until usually October, November, and we direct market them into the city here. It's not a very big operation, but like I said, it's one of my favorites. We do the same rotational grazing with the pigs that we do with the cattle. It's just a little bit different setup. The concepts are still the same. So we're trying to do short graze periods, we're trying to do longer rest periods, good animal impact, good stock density, and we try and leave lots of residue to build the soil armor. With the pigs though, they are not a ruminant, so we do supply them with a little bit of grain. You can see the grain truck in the background here. It does have an organic oat and barley mixture. It's only a supplement to them though. The forage is definitely their main diet. They really like the broadleafs, so the clovers, the dandelions, that's their favorite. That's the first thing they'll eat. If you leave them in there in a paddock long enough, they will eat the grass, but they prefer the roots of the grass, so that's when they start rooting. So we try and move the fence before they damage it too much because pigs naturally do root. I broadcast out clovers and some broadleaf, different types of plants following grazing, because they do beat up areas of it, so it's good to throw some seed out there. And then the next year we've got some good broadleaves for them to graze on. Well, how we set this up is we've got this cage. It's a portable cell center. So a cell center would be an area with their water in the middle, and then we've got paddocks all the way around the outside of it. And that's what we do with this, but except it's portable, we can move it. So we'll have this cage, which is their home base. It's got the grain and water in it and their swimming pool, which I'll show you. We set up electric netting around the outside of this. We can probably do 5 or 6 paddocks around the outside of this and then basically rotate around this cell center. And when we're done, then we move the whole system over another 500 yards and do it all again. So we basically move this whole cell center around this paddock. It's about a 10-acre paddock, and the cows actually come in here during the season once or twice as well to knock it down. So that keeps the forage in really good quality for the pigs. So they have basically second cut all season long. They get really good, a really good diet. We do have a swimming pool in the background for them. If you make a mud hole for them, you have to haul a lot of water. If you see in the background, we've got a portable water tank. So we give them a little swimming pool here that the water doesn't seep away, so they always have a place to go cool off on a hot day. Make sure we have a tarp over top of it. It's not to protect them from the rain, it's to protect them from the sun. On hot days, they need to get out of the sun and have a little bit of shade. We actually cut holes in a brand new tarp to let the rain go through the tarp. And we've got our grain hoppers mounted to the side of this cage, as well as the swimming pool and the water trough here. Everything's attached to the cage, so when we move the cage, everything moves with it. We just have to take the electric netting down, obviously, and drag this with a pickup or the backhoe. We can move it around pretty easily. So, one thing that we've tried a few times, we kind of go back and forth between for our water. We do have a nipple system attached to this cage. Depending where we're at and how we're doing it. This year we're not doing it because we're supplying apple cider vinegar to the pigs. They get a little bit in their water every day. And the problem with the apple cider vinegar is you can't use any metal containers, metal tank. It's got to be rubber because the apple cider vinegar will react with the metal. So everything's got to be plastic. So the nipples have got metal pipe in them, so we can't really run it through there. Our water tank is also metal, so we can't put it in there. We have to put it in after once it's in the troughs. So this year we're not using the nipple system, but we do have that option here if we need to. We don't use any parasite controls other than natural, so the apple cider vinegar is for that. We do give them diatomaceous earth a few times during the season, but we haven't had any major issues. They seem to do quite well. They'll be 170 to 200 pounds by October, November. So we direct market our pasture pork into the city. We butcher I think we got 24 this year. So probably half of those will get sold directly as halves and wholes in the fall. And the remainder we cut up into our picks. And then all winter we sell pork packages, $100 pork packages, randomly to people in the city that maybe they don't have the freezer space. And we deliver into the city. We're about 45 minutes out, so we'll actually deliver right to their door. One of the most common questions I get is about rejuvenating pasture. And yes, you can do all sorts of different things with rejuvenating pasture. You can zero till in, you can broadcast and trample, you can try and get a lot of different things into there, but a lot of that costs you some money. One of my favorite methods of rejuvenating a pasture is called deferred grazing. And that's what we're doing with this piece right here. Now, of this whole pasture, we took this over 2 years ago, so this is our second summer grazing it. This particular part of the pasture was the most overgrazed. It was closest to the water. These couple of paddocks here were just grazed to nothing, whereas some of the farther away stuff was a lot more residue left and in a lot better shape. We decided to do a deferred grazing on these couple of paddocks here, and you can kind of see in the background here that the grass has already started to go to seed. So we're getting a little bit too mature for grazing. Normally we're coming around with our second rotation right now, we would hit this one, but we're gonna skip it. A couple of these paddocks, we're gonna go past them. Everything else is in good shape, and we wanna make sure we don't get behind on it. We don't want it to get too mature. But this one, because we wanna heal it, we have a different purpose. So we're gonna actually skip it and come around to it on the next rotation and knock it down again. So we did graze it once early this spring. We're gonna skip it on this rotation, let these plants go to seed, leave lots of residue. And when we graze it in the fall, we're gonna just step it to the ground and leave as much residue as possible. I might miss a couple of days worth of grazing, but I look at that as the value, the lost revenue out of that as a custom grazer, as fertility added for later, for next year. So the more residue we can get here, the more water holding capacity we can start to build up, the more nutrient cycling we can start to get going. We can get more seeds in the seed bank by letting these go to seed. And one of the best ways that I've found to rejuvenate land is just to let it go. And then come in later with some good stock density and step it all to the ground. So that's what we're trying to do here, is just improve this pasture with virtually zero inputs. We haven't broadcast anything out here. We've got a good wet year this year, so clover comes really nice, even naturally. We didn't seed any of this clover, just the wet year, and clover loves wet feet. So that's one of my favorite ways to rejuvenate a piece of pasture, is by just deferred grazing. Okay, let's go to the next site. Well, we won't get to this location on a regular pasture walk, so this is kind of special. We've set up these bat houses out here, and I'm a big fan of predators. In agriculture, everybody hates predators, but I love predators. A couple years ago, I've got a landowner's place not too far from here, and in the watershed, I opened the door one day going in to turn the water on, and these 3 little bats were having a little nap in the door jamb. So got me thinking that they're looking for a place to sleep during the day. So maybe I should give them that. If they're gonna work for me, I gotta give them room and board. So we had these bat houses built, and we're trying a couple different designs. The ones right here beside me, they are called 4-chamber bat houses. I've got 2 of them on this pole back to back. One's facing north and one's facing south. That gives the bats a choice of which side to go in, whether it's too warm in one side or cooler in the other. And each one is a 300 bat capacity, so total of 600 bats could technically be in on this bat house right here. And the one in behind us is actually called a rocket house. It's kind of got 4 chambers all around the outside. So we're just kind of experimenting to see which ones they like better. I had the fella from the Alberta bat community come out, and we designed it at a certain spot here. The bats like to shelter the trees 2 different ways. They need water relatively close. Right on the other side of these trees, there's a riparian area, so they've got water close by. And they do an amazing job at insect control for me. That's their job. Mosquitoes, flies, you name it. I was told years ago that a bat can eat up to 9 times its body weight a day in insects. So that's pretty good. So maybe it's 9 times a night, because they work at night and they sleep during the day. I'm very excited to see these bat houses fill up. Hopefully in the next year or so they will. I haven't seen a lot of activity, but the fellows from the bat community said that it would take a year or 2 at least before they kind of know they're here. So hopefully that speeds up. Now, the first year I was concerned, when the cattle came into this paddock, they would rub on these bat houses, and I imagine that old bat house up top was shaking pretty good. We put another fence out here around it to protect them so the cattle can't rub on it now. So there's a little area here that's totally excluded from grazing, and just so that the cattle can't rub on these posts. So that was a concern. We got to keep our tenants happy or they're not going to stick around. Okay, I'd like to talk about some legume grazing. Everybody's worried about bloat. Jim Garish coined a phrase years ago that we have more economic losses in agriculture today because of the fear of bloat than we would ever get from bloat. Basically, everybody's so scared of legumes because some cattle might end up bloating up and dying on it that, you know, we're scared to put them in. Legumes give us free nitrogen. Okay? Nitrogen is one of the biggest nutrients that we manage in modern agriculture. I just let the plants and soil organisms manage it for me. It's not actually the legume that brings the nitrogen in for you. It's the symbiotic relationship with the bacteria. The legume gives sugar to the bacteria. In return, the bacteria gives nitrogen to the plant. Okay, so it's just a trading market back and forth. So, but legumes are a very common plant to do that. There's other bacteria in the soil that will also do that. You don't have to have legumes to be bringing in nitrogen, but it's an easy way to do that. So I make sure I have lots of legumes in my pasture. But everybody's so concerned about bloat. Now, honestly, if we were not so afraid of legumes and we would have had legumes in our pasture for the last 20 years, our genetics would be better. Okay, we've got this system where there's some animals that are more bloat sensitive than others. Yes, I would agree to that. But if we're not ever culling them or letting nature cull them for us, then our genetics are getting worse every year. So that being said, I don't get to choose the genetics that come in here. I'm a custom grazer, so I have to manage for bloat, and I have some some pastures that are pretty high in legume. Basically, bloat is caused from a change in diet too quickly. Okay, so if they go from a grass pasture onto a heavy legume pasture, the bacteria in the rumen that decompose the legume isn't there. So when you throw a whole bunch of legume into their stomach, the bacteria can't break it down, and it ends up causing a bloat. I won't get into details on that, but basically that's what it is. So we got to just make sure we don't change their diet too quickly. Pretty simple. Here at Greener Pastures, what we do is if we're getting onto some high legume pasture, we basically introduce it to them gradually over a couple of days. Let's say this whole quarter, most of it has high legume on it, but one paddock is not quite as much. Well, that'll be the first one I hit. Make sure they get just a little bit of the legume. Get that in there and get those bacteria in their gut starting to reproduce to get more of them that can break down the legume. If I don't have that option, what I might do is just give them a small piece of it, right? Electric fence off a corner of that alfalfa field or that clover field. Let them come in there for the afternoon, graze down a couple hours worth of grazing, and then they go back to their other paddock and fill up on the rest of that. So obviously those girls are wanting in here. They're helping me today. But they're already accustomed to it. They're on a pasture that got legume into it. So for me to turn them into this pasture with high legume, they've already got those bugs in their stomach. So they're not going to be an issue. The stage of growth is a big factor. This alfalfa right here is quite mature. It's already in the flower. Not that risky. If it's a lot younger and lusher, it'll be higher risk. There's also higher risk in the morning. If you turn them into a paddock early in the morning, there's higher risk because of the switch between photosynthesis during the day and respiration at night. Causes the risk to be a little bit higher. Also, if there's moisture on it, right? Extra moisture, if you just had a rainy day or rainy spell, we want to try to limit that as well. So how do we manage here at Greener Pastures? Really simple. We move daily through any high legume pastures, and we move every afternoon. Okay? So basically they're getting the same diet every day into their gut. So picture that in the morning they wake up, they're on yesterday's leftovers. Okay, the paddock that they're on, right? They've chewed most of it down, it's knocked down. They get to clean it up in the morning, right? Got to make sure they have plenty left. They get to clean up in the morning and fill their guts. Then in the afternoon, we give them their dessert. Okay, we open them up into the new paddock. They come out here and they top up on all the really good stuff, right? They eat all the leaves and the fine leaves and the clover and the alfalfa. But they already got a full gut, so it doesn't really, it's not pure legume in their gut. And then the next day, the same thing. They get up in the morning and they clean up on yesterday's leftovers, and then they get their dessert in the afternoon. So, and if it's raining or it's really high risky, a lot younger plant than this, then we might move multiple times a day. Okay, we might move 2 or 3 times throughout the day to make sure they eat the stem and the leaves together. And that way they don't get that lush leaves all in one gulp. But I will say that in my 20 years here at Greener Pastures Ranching, I think I've only had one animal that's ever died of bloat because we manage for it. We don't use any products, anything to other than just management. And I had one calf one year that I kept sneaking under the wire and getting out ahead of me in the legume, and then one morning it was dead. So I'm going to say that one was a bloat. But other than that, we've never had a bloat storm here yet, knock on wood. So you just need to manage for it. Again, we move daily and we move in the afternoon. And there we have it. That concludes our 2020 Pasture Walk. Thanks for attending. If you want more information, we do have a book, the Calendar of the Year-Round Grazer. You can order it through the stockmangrassfarmer.com and go to their bookshelf. And we have a lot more information if you want to follow our Facebook page at Greener Pastures Ranching, or check out our website, or you can contact the Gateway Research Organization and look at their Facebook page and their YouTube channel. And there's all sorts of information at both those sites. So thanks again for attending, and we'll see you next year, maybe in person.